Now, how can you not love a book whose initials abbreviate to IDHEF TBA? Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, and today we're starting a multi-part video series examining a book by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek with the amusingly ironic title of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Published by Crossway in March of 2004, it is currently ranked by Amazon at the number 4 spot in science and religion books and number 11 in Christian apologetics, which is pretty good for a book published almost 20 years ago as of the time I'm making this video. Now, Dr. Geisler, for those of you who may not know, was a prominent Bible scholar and apologist and author of over 100 books and co-founder of the Southern Evangelical Seminary. So he brings the book some of the best biblical scholarship available in evangelical Christianity. And I'm choosing my words carefully when I say that, but I mean what I say. This book represents some of the best of what evangelical Christianity has to offer as far as scholarship is concerned. Frank Turek, on the other hand, brings more of a popular apologetic approach to the book. He's the president of crossexamined.org, which is an apologetics ministry that reported over $1 million in revenue in 2020, where Dr. Geisler brings the book an academic background. Frank Turek supplies a people-friendly language and presentation that makes the book more approachable for non-academic folks. Geisler knows the material, and Turek knows the audience, and that's a powerful combination. Where I think they really struck gold, though, is in that title. And that title is golden. And I want to say a few words about that because I think the title is a big part of the reason why this book is still selling so well 19 plus years on. Deep down, there's nothing a believer would like better than to turn the tables on skeptics and cast themselves as the ones with the facts and atheists as the ones with blind faith. And the appeal of this fantasy springs from one of the deepest sources of cognitive dissonance in the heart of Christian faith, which is the fact that God don't actually show up in real life. He don't speak up audibly where everyone can hear him. He don't appear visibly where everybody can see him. The things he supposedly does, he does in a mysterious way that prevents us from objectively verifying that it was really him that done it. And that just ain't the way things ought to be if he was real. I mean, if there was an almighty, all-knowing, all-wise, and all-loving God who wanted us to know him and trust him and love him, then he ought to be showing up in real life just like he does in the stories. If God was actually real, not only would there not be any atheists, there wouldn't be any apologists neither. We wouldn't need them. He'd be right there in front of us all the time, more obvious than the sun and the moon and the earth itself. And of course he ain't. Everybody knows that, and believers are painfully aware of it, at least at some level. There's undeniable evidence that should be there, and it ain't there. And if you're a believer, that hurts. You'd be a lot happier if it was atheists who didn't have any evidence, so you could be the ones looking down on them. Proudly proclaiming, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Well, that's denialism at its finest. If it bugs you that you ain't got the evidence you ought to have, then just pretend it's really atheists who ain't got it. Put the burden of proof on them, and just assume that if they can't prove that they ain't a God, then by default there is. And while you're at it, you can go ahead and assume that it's your God specifically. And boom, problem solved. Or at least compartmentalized. Of course, there's still a problem. Hebrews 11 and verse 1 says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. In other words, it's what you believe in the absence of supporting evidence, or even in the presence of contrary evidence. Hebrews 11 goes on to list heroes of the Old Testament who became heroes because they believed in things just because they was told to, and then it warns us that without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So if you want to please God, you need to believe despite any evidence or lack thereof. And that kind of makes sense, because according to gospel story, we're all such horrible sinners that we deserve to be banished from God's presence and condemned to an eternity of fire and torment. And the only way we can escape that doom is to have faith. Faith, somehow, is such a superlative achievement that it qualifies us not only to escape the most awful punishment imaginable, but also to enjoy the most wonderful reward imaginable. And that's quite a change. But now, if you only believe the things that you have reasonable, verifiable evidence for, that ain't a particularly virtuous achievement. I mean, you'll probably understand the real world a lot better than somebody who believes everything they read on the internet. But I mean, it ain't the kind of achievement that would merit being transferred from the evil list to the blessed list. The whole point of justification by faith is that you resisted secular, worldly approaches to knowledge and chose to believe the gospel by faith alone, despite the material evidence. And that's what makes the title of the book so unintentionally funny. What Geisler and Turek are bragging about is that, allegedly, they are not taking the gospel on faith alone. They's only accepting conclusions, or at least they claim they's only accepting conclusions, if and they can reliably and verifiably be demonstrated as true. And the problem is, that ain't what the Bible calls faith. Which is why I said this book springs from one of the deepest sources of cognitive dissonance in the Christian faith. Geisler and Turek know that truth ought to be able to stand up to skeptical scrutiny, and they're desperate to claim that Christianity does, which conflicts with reality to the point that they end up casting themselves in the role of people who have no faith and atheists as people who do. But let's move on, because we already got several minutes into this video and we ain't even got past the title of the book yet. So let's open this book up and see what we got inside. And by the way, I should mention that I got my copy of the book secondhand in order not to contribute any money to any apologetics ministry, because, I don't support that kind of thing. But anyway, whoever owned the book before me was apparently a believer, and here and there, they've highlighted passages that they liked in yellow, which is interesting, but it might be a distraction. And I'll be including some photos of some of the pages I'll be referring to, but if you see yellow highlighting, just remember that ain't mine. Oh, and also, we're going to skip over the introduction by David Limbaugh. There's a few interesting things in there, but then again, we've just taken I don't know how many minutes just discussing the book title, so we better get right on into what Geisler and Turek have to say, or we'll be here all year. So here we go. Idhef TBA Chapter 1. Or actually, let's look at the preface, because there's some stuff in there that's worth covering, starting with the heading. How much faith do you need to believe this book? And right off the bat, we get a straw man version of how skeptics approach truth claims. Notice the first two words, religious skeptics. Now, a real skeptic is somebody who evaluates truth claims based on the verifiability of the evidence and the validity of the logic and such. It don't matter whether it's about religion or science or whatever. So really, there ain't no such thing as a religious skeptic. You either skeptical or you ain't. By using the phrase religious skeptics, though, Geisler and Turek are invoking one of the most common misconceptions about skepticism, mainly that being skeptical just means denying whatever you don't want to believe. And from that perspective, a quote-unquote religious skeptic is just somebody who's out to deny religion no matter what. So Geisler and Turek introduced their book by claiming that so-called religious skeptics is going to tell you that this book can't be trusted because it's written by religious folks who are biased in favor of their religion. And the counter-argument is that, well, firstly, everybody's biased, so if you can't trust religious writers, then you can't trust atheists either. And secondly, Geisler and Turek argue that biased people can sometimes be trusted to tell the truth. For example, Holocaust survivors discussing the Holocaust. And they wrap up their preface with an appeal to fairness and objectivity. Quote, "You should believe or disbelieve what we say because of the evidence we present, not because we have a certain set of religious beliefs." Unquote. And that sounds all fair and good and objective and stuff, so it's kind of a shame that they've already started stacking the deck in their own favor. The problem with the preface is that it's been constructed in a way that subtly undermines the reader's objectivity and predisposes them to favor interpretations that confirm their pre-existing religious biases. Notice, for example, that the emphasis is on who to trust rather than on how to evaluate truth claims. And from the very first two words of the first sentence, we learn who not to trust. Quote unquote, religious skeptics who unfairly reject religious claims just cause they's religious. I mean, even the phrase religious skeptics is prejudicially ambiguous. Are they religious skeptics in the sense of being skeptical about religion? Or are they religious skeptics in the sense of making a religion out of denying the Bible? Well, it could be either one, and neither one is good. And notice, too, how the emphasis is on giving the reader permission to believe what biased sources say. There's no mention of things like fact-checking or testing your hypotheses or any of the other tools we use to examine the reliability of truth claims. All we get is a choice between black and white alternatives. Either we trust what biased people say, or else we can't trust anything. And since that's clearly unworkable, we're left with no choice but to trust what biased people say. Except the religious skeptics, of course. We can't trust them guys at all. And what makes this preface particularly insidious is that there's a grain of truth in what they say, or at least a grain of half-truth. Geisler and Turek are presenting trust as something you either got or ain't got, all or nothing, black or white. But that ain't how trust works. Trust can be both partial and provisional. That is to say, you can hear a truth claim and conclude that parts of it are true and other parts ain't. And even when you think a claim is true, you can reserve the right to revise your conclusions pending the arrival of new information. That's why tools like testing and fact-checking and such are so important. It ain't enough to decide who you trust and distrust. You need to examine each and every truth claim a person makes, whether you trust the person or not. You don't trust in the sense of just taking their word for it, because they could be wrong or misinformed or deluded or lying or even deceiving themselves and trying to drag you along with them. So in that sense, yes, skeptics will tell you that you can't read a religious book written by a biased person and just take their word for it. You can't trust anything you read in the sense of just believing what you're told just because you was told it. You need to examine the claims in the light of the verifiable evidence and sound logic. And Geisler and Turek try and make it sound like that's the bad alternative, but it ain't. That's how understanding works. That's skepticism, evidence-based belief. That's why they close their preface by trying to paint themselves as the true skeptics, because skepticism is the path to true understanding and reliable knowledge, and experience bears that out. And the problem is, that ain't the path to faith in God, and Geisler and Turek know it. So they have to introduce their book with a preface that gives readers permission to dismiss so-called religious skeptics as being biased and unreliable, and also permission to believe biased religious writers, such as themselves, on the ground that we ain't really got any other choice. That's the mindset that Geisler and Turek want us to have as we approach this book, and that's worth noticing. There's just one last closing note that I want to point out before we finish, and that's this one little truth claim they kind of snuck into the very first paragraph. Look at this. Quote, "That's the way skeptics view the Bible. It's a biased book written by biased people. Their assessment may be true for some books about religion, but it's not true for them all." unquote. Did you catch that? There may be some books out there that you should read carefully, considering the biases and cultural context and knowledge of the authors, but there's other books out there that we should just accept, unquestioned and unexamined, as the complete, objective, and unbiased truth. And I wonder which books those would be. As a famous t-shirt once said, the opposite of faith is skepticism, and the opposite of skepticism is gullibility. If you believe that there's books out there that's 100% free from bias, you may be part of just the target audience that Geisler and Turek is looking for. And I'm sure that there's more that could be said, but that about wraps it up for me for today. Thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.